Good afternoon, everyone. I know it's hot and it's the weekend, but I'm glad you all took the time to be here today. Hot. The word has so many different meanings to a variety of different people. Universally, however, the word means having a high degree of heat or high temperature. In the science field, hot temperatures can be applied to nearly all aspects of climatic and environmental changes that either induce or reduce variables in data results. Hot can be applied to what's happening today. At the topic of every discussion in the science world, it encompasses two phrases: climate change and global warming. The dependency on Earth's natural resources has quadrupled, and the versions of its previous state are either under or overestimated due to the anthropogenic methodologies and an increase in climatic and environmental factors. Based on research conducted by scientists and conservationists, global warming has negatively impacted all flora and fauna wildlife species, not to mention the impacts within the socioeconomic welfare of entities that depend on those species for either survival or just a simple way to substantiate their way of life. Abundancy and availability are two key factors when establishing what one would consider home or habitat. In 1840, the United States became home to approximately 17.1 million residents who shared that habitat or that home with an insurmountable number of other species. Let's fast forward 140 years later. In 1988, after the U.S. population reached approximately 244 million, for those of you who remember, Dr. James Hansen testified that due to an increase of greenhouse gases resulting from our carbon footprint, the effects of climate change and global warming were already taking place. We see it in the fish and wildlife management programs and conservation programs or plans that are being implemented all across the globe. Habitat loss. Conservation plans ending with more research is needed or more monitoring is required because they have phrases in there that deal or talk about climatic and environmental factors. Impending effects. In perspective, that same year, 1988, the state of California was renowned as the most populated and most polluted state in the US. That's the entire country. So let's get down to the basics. My thesis is going backwards is the only way to move forward in conservation. Or we can just wait and see what happens to California. We're not necessarily talking about rewilding of North America. We're not talking about the reintroduction of different species who are on the verge of being endangered or completely extirpated or extinct. We're talking about the viability of fish and wildlife management programs and conservation plans that talk about the allocation of resources that are running thin, poor quality, or just running out. There are case studies that cultivate fish and wildlife management programs into conservation plans, plans that state that is within our power as conservationists or scientists, or even just the public, to provide resources to these species who are threatened or endangered or even listed as concern. Anything that they need to survive, and if they're lucky to thrive. For most of you who don't know, there is a fine line between surviving and thriving. Most of which species are just surviving. They're not thriving today. Anthropogenic factors are laced with carbon footprints that limit the Earth's ability to regulate environments, kind of like in a pre-industrial revolution way, otherwise known as rewilding. California should be the focus on mitigating those factors simply because it is the most populated and most polluted state in the country. Successes and failures of the fish and wildlife management programs within the state that incorporate plans to allocate water and land resources are being implemented amidst the worst environmental catastrophes the state has ever seen since 1987, since the country has ever seen. And we're going back a year before Dr. Hansen gave his testimony of climatic impacts. the impacts of global warming. Those catastrophes come in many forms, most notably in the form of severe degradation of water sources. California has changed in the last less than 20 years. Now California has severe drought conditions attributed to global warming that are year-long. They're not seasonal anymore. Currently, there are approximately 284 threatened or endangered federal and state species listed under the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, or CDFW. That's 284 different species competing for the same resources that nearly 40 million residents lay claim to. And now that currently the public and the municipalities that regulate the state's Fish and Wildlife Department are questioning whether or not the viability of current and future conservation plans for these species are sustainable due to the degradation of water resources. The water quality has gone down, the availability of land has decreased. And it's all attributed to climatic and environmental factors, i.e. global warming. And just to put it into perspective, severe drought conditions have been instrumental in the worst wildfires the country has ever seen, all in the state of California. California loses more resources to wildfires than any other state and holds the record for amount of acres lost annually. That's each year. Research included within the constructs of fish and wildlife management programs and conservation plans refer to climate change and global warming as data variables, or indicates that consistent monitoring or more research is needed to quantify impending effects. Those are open-ended conservation plans for these species. Most of the conservation plans that have been researched and the data analysis that have been conducted show that most of the plans to address habitat loss for these species who are threatened or endangered, they're only addressing the symptoms of these variables, the variables that they call climatic and environmental factors. And the symptoms of these variables have been ineffective in mitigating the failures of reaching management or conservation long-term objectives. So the facts: development and growth that equals population increase, carbon footprint increase. Data analysis actually shows that a lot of conservation plans that are within the United States reference California's fish and wildlife management programs and conservation programs. They emulate those programs and plans. Why is that? Is it because they are referencing the same species? Or is it because it's well known that California is suffering and it is the most populated, it is the most polluted? And if conservation plans and fish and wildlife management programs, if their long-term objectives can be achieved in California, then California can benchmark the success rate, increase the success rate of these conservation plans and fish and wildlife management programs. They can substantiate long-term objectives being achieved. In other words, if species can make it there in California, then they can make it anywhere. Scientists like Dr. James Hansen, has made it clear that if greenhouse gases are not mitigated and decreased tremendously, the seventh extinction will be just as large as the first cataclysmic fall of the dinosaurs, except this time it'll be the collapse of the atmosphere and the degradation of environmental integrity that has already started to show signs and effects from global warming. Instead of the conservation plans and fish and wildlife management programs in California addressing the symptoms of global warming, they need to address the root cause. They cannot substantiate and do resource allocations to mitigate habitat loss for these 284 species that they have listed as either threatened or endangered without addressing the root cause, because the conservation plans and programs will always end with more research is needed, more monitoring is needed because of climatic and environmental factors. How do you mitigate that? You mitigate it by cutting the emissions. You lead the way. If every other conservation plan and program is looking at California and how they're implementing and achieving their long-term objectives when it comes to mitigating habitat loss and making sure that these species are not going to be extinct within the next 20 years, then California needs to address the root cause. The time to change fish and wildlife management methodologies is now. The time to start was 1988. It's been 33 years, 21,823,527 acres burned, and 284 threatened and endangered species later. Or we can just wait and see what happens to California.